Welcome everybody to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Today it's unusual in the sense that we'll be talking about me rather than about our guests, and I'm delighted to say that a very long-term friend of mine called Martin Higgins, who's a journalist and writer, has agreed to interview me on my book, The Infinite Minefield. Martin recently interviewed me on his own show, and that's proved to be extremely popular. Maybe Martin will tell us a little bit about his own show later on as well, because it's worth checking out. He's interviewed some very, very interesting people, including Dean Radin. But effectively, what we're going to be talking about today is the new book and exactly why I wrote it and some of the things that I discovered during my research. But very quickly, before we start off properly, I'd just like to discuss a little bit about what happened yesterday, in that we, myself and Dr. Dirk Prokol and Dr. Engelbert Winkler and a couple of other guys were at the Mind, Body and Spirit Festival in Brighton. In fact, they're still here today because it's a 3-day event. I was just there yesterday because I was doing a special presentation there during the afternoon. But myself and Martin Huckster, another long-term Itladian member of my group, came down with me, and we spent the day at the festival. But what was interesting was that the general response to the hypnagogic light device, which is the invention that I discuss in 2 of my books, including The Infinite Minefield, which has been invented by the 2 Austrian doctors, is a machine that actually facilitates the altered states of consciousness. And in my new book, I suggest various models by the way this may function, and we'll touch on those later, hopefully, if we get the opportunity. But what is interesting is that fairly recently, Dr. Winkler and Dr. Prokol were in contact with Stanislav Grof, the American psychologist, I suppose, what's the better term. And Stan has this particular technique of holotropic breathing. And what my Austrian friends have discovered is that if you use the hypnagogic light device and at the same time you are trained to do this kind of very, very deep breathing that Stan has invented, you can have very much more extreme experiences under the lucid light device that have previously been recorded. And Dr. Prokol was explaining to me yesterday that when somebody is dying, what tends to happen is that they go through 3 different phases of breathing. And I wasn't aware of this, that apparently you breathe in one way, then you breathe in another, and you breathe in another. And as you're doing so, more and more carbon dioxide is actually effectively, I suppose, poisoning the brain in many, many ways. But what it does is it makes these sensations, these intense visions and images that you get using the lucid light device even more powerful. Now, of course, this clearly, again, draws parallels, as I've done many times, with the near-death experience, because the lucid light device seems to generate these sensations of going towards a tunnel and going through a tunnel. So that's just an interesting development, which I will keep you briefed on as time goes on. Okay, without further ado, what I'd like to do now is to hand myself over to the tender mercies of Martin Higgins, who's up there on Wallasey and the Wirral, which is my hometown. And as I said to Dia before we went on air, but if Martin and I start to lapse into dialect, please excuse us, because we're both from that specific area, which is known as God's Holy Acre twixt Mersey and Dee. But let's hope that we don't get too broad in our responses. Okay, Martin, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. So this is your 5th book, The Infinite Minefield, is that right?
Yeah, effectively it's my 5th if you don't include the book I co-edited and wrote a part of with Dr. Mahendra Pereira on the near-death experience, but effectively I don't consider that to be directly my book, so yes, it is.
And how does it fit into your work so far, and what's been its contribution to where your work is going?
Well, phenomenal, really. I mean, one of the things that, and you'll know as much as probably more than most people, Martin, because you've been involved in my work for probably at least 5 years, is that all my books have been iterative in the sense that they develop a hypothesis stage by stage. Although the curious thing is that I was never planning to develop an idea, and the idea is the way I've done so. In fact, when I wrote Is There Life After Death, I expected that to be my one and only book, because, you genuinely believe that you've got one book inside you and that's about it, because it's the one that's been playing around in your mind for many years. But what I found is that as I began to talk to people like yourself and broaden my horizons in terms of the individuals that I was actually talking to, the papers I was reading, and the information I received through reading and through talking to people, was that it started to move in a particular direction. And that direction it's been moving in really, I think, has culminated in the latest book, The Infinite Minefield, because I think this book genuinely pulls everything together. Whether it's the final volume, I don't think it is, but it's really progressed my ideas considerably further down the path away from the idea of being very, very based in the neurology of the brain, the neurochemical reactions in the brain, and suggesting that, consciousness is effectively an epiphenomenon of brain behaviors and brain structures, to a much more wider, non-dual worldview that effectively consciousness is far more than an epiphenomenon of the brain, and what happens when we die is effectively similar to what I put forward in the first book, but on a much broader horizon. The idea that consciousness is more of a field, that kind of thing. So more in keeping. So
this is sort of a. Sorry, this is a panpsychic sort of perspective you've moved to.
Yeah, to a certain extent, panpsychism is probably the perfect term for it, in the sense that I had never particularly realised in my early years that my position had been somewhat restricted in this. And when I discovered there was a book I read about 3 or 4 years ago called Panpsychism in the West. The author escapes me now, but effectively this book very much changed my opinion about how this belief system, again, is nothing new. The idea that there is a unity of consciousness, and as has been very much said, we're one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, as Bill Hicks very, very cleverly said in one of his comedy monologues, is that this does seem to be the strong evidence that this is the case. And there is strong scientific evidence that this may indeed be the case. For instance, on this show in recent months, we've interviewed Professor Bernard Haisch, and we've also interviewed Dr. Martin W. Ball, both of whom take the approach of what we call the entheological paradigm, which is the idea that through entheogens, this is substances like dimethyltryptamine and similar substances, we can actually access the God within, and indeed the God without, because the idea is that we are just one entity. And of course, yes, go Martin.
Sorry. Yeah, so this is what you're putting forward in the book, that it's the pineal gland that acts as a kind of our link between our individual organisms and the universal mind. Was that a hypothesis that you started with? Did you have a hypothesis when you started the book?
No, not at all. I mean, that's one of the way I write is always I go with the flow, in that I will follow my nose, or I'll follow my daemon, which is probably more of an accurate description if you actually use my own worldview, in the sense that my own daemon, my own higher self or whatever, seems to guide me along certain lines, and I just follow it. And again, it happened again with this book. It was effectively I'd come across one academic paper, which would lead to another academic paper, which would then lead to another article, and slowly the picture sort of came into focus. But I had no initial plans to go down the route. I was intrigued about the pineal gland, and I did touch upon the pineal gland at the end of my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, because of the experiences I personally had with the hypnagogic light device, the lucid light device, because I believed that, and I still do, that device in some way opened up my pineal gland. It sort of seemed to activate it in some way. So in which case, it's a personal thing. But I'll give an example of just how ideas seem to come to me and flow towards me in a very, as we would say, us Italians call it, synchronidipitous, that effectively there just seems to be the coincidences that come together. Is that a few weeks ago, quite by chance, I came across a paper written by a guy called Professor John Joe McFadden, who is a research molecular biologist at the University of Surrey. And John Joe McFadden has come up with the most amazing hypothesis about how the brain works that I've come across since the Hamerhoff and Penrose idea of ORCO-R. And in fact, I think it's a more powerful explanator of how the brain functions. And John Joe suggests that we know that each neuron of the brain has an action potential which is effectively like a small electrical impulse or electrochemical impulse that goes from one end of the neuron to the other, which is activated by, manipulated by calcium ions. And by calcium ions, negative and positive charges makes the charge run down. Now, what he's noted is, and this is a known scientific fact, that this action generates a very, very small electromagnetic field around the neuron. Now, if you multiply this by the 10 billion neurons that are in your brain, suddenly you have a very, very effective electromagnetic field. And John Joe suggests that consciousness is not located in the neurons at all, but is actually located within the electromagnetic field that is generated by the neurons. So suddenly we have this fascinating idea that the neurons are facilitators of consciousness, but not in the way the standard science suggests, because one of the great mysteries of science is how is consciousness generated by neurons? Well, it's generated because it's in a field that's outside of the neurons. Now, this explains one of the major mysteries of modern science, which is the binding problem. You know, how it is that when I see a red car drive down the road, I see a red car. Whereas what is happening inside the brain is that the part, the red, is being processed by the visual areas of the brain, which is at the back of the head, the visual cortex, whereas the movement of the car is actually generated somewhere else in the brain. I think it's the prefrontal cortex, but I'm not entirely sure on that. I need to check that up. But effectively, they're quite a distance away from each other, but they instantaneously, or something brings the two elements together to create a controlled image. And this is the same for everything we perceive. And this thing is called the binding problem. Now, if consciousness is an electromagnetic field, it works on field principles, which means that a field communicates, every part of a field instantaneously communicates with every other part. So this is a fascinating development, and I'm hoping to meet John Joe this Wednesday, because I'm doing a big event in London. I'm doing a debate in London, in central London, and I'm hoping that John Joe is going to be able to attend. So this just shows how the ideas develop. Now, this is not in the book. This is something that would have been in the book had I known about it, but it's already ideas for taking the book a bit further on.
Mm-hmm. So, what is the role of the pineal gland? And I read that there are crystals around the pineal, and that they can tune into electromagnetic radiation?
Correct.
How does that work?
Well, again, this is with the work of John Joe. This becomes even more interesting. You know, within the pineal gland, there are deposits which are called pineal sand, and they're very, very small crystals. And these crystals, like typical crystals, are piezoelectric. So they actually can go very, very sensitive to changes in electromagnetic fields. Now, when I was a kid, you used to make crystal sets, which was a kind of very, very primitive radio that you'd use a crystal, and a crystal would actually pick up the electromagnetic energy in the atmosphere around. Now, again, what is intriguing here is that the reason that they've started moving along these lines is because of the way, and I mention this in the book, is the mystery of how pigeons can find themselves, can home. You can put a pigeon anywhere, but it will find its way back to where its home is. Now, around about 3 years ago, there was, I think it was probably solar energy storms or something that took place. And what happened was there was pigeon racing going on in the north of England at that time, and most of the pigeons got totally lost. And the reason they got lost was that the electromagnetic energy that was actually hitting the atmosphere was actually confusing the tiny piece of magnetite again, which is piezoelectric, which is in the front of the nose of the pigeons. And it was confusing them. So this goes to show that even the pigeons themselves use electromagnetic radiation to get themselves around the world. Now, if the pineal gland, and the pineal gland is piezoelectric, it means it's sensitive to electromagnetic fields, which could explain why it is that ghosts are seen in certain circumstances. Now, we had earthlights. You know, I know somebody called Paul Devereaux has been doing a lot of work on the idea of UFOs being seen in places where the tectonic plates are very, very close together. And indeed, as a nice tie-in, my latest book, Philip K. Dick, on Philip K. Dick, a man who remembered the future, I suggest that some of the reasons why Philip K. Dick had his theophany and his very, very curious experiences is that he was living very, very close to a fault line. And ironically enough, or interesting enough, it was only yesterday that I met somebody who had visited Marin County, where Phil lived with his third wife, Anne. Third wife, Anne. And Marin County apparently is right on the San Andreas Fault. So effectively, Philip K. Dick's visions that he had even in the early 60s were related in some way to electromagnetic energy. So here we have the idea that the pineal gland can influence the way we perceive external reality.
But what's the connection to the fault lines and the Earth's energy then? How does that?
Well, what happens is there's certain forms of energy that are given off near fault lines, and it's a similar kind of energy to the energy that Michael Persinger has been working with at the Laurentian University in Sudbury in Canada. And as you know, as you may know, I know you will know, but the audience may not know this, that this guy has been working with a converted, I think it's either a cycling helmet or a American football helmet with electrodes inside it. And what he does is he uses the electrodes to stimulate the cerebral cortex. And in doing so, he can actually engender sensed presences, feelings that there's an entity close by, feelings of seeing things. Now, this shows how electromagnetic energy, which can be generated literally by the movement of the Earth, the actual friction between the fault lines, which generates the energy, and how this energy can be reproduced by Michael Persinger in such a way that it can influence the brain and how we perceive things. Now, it has been argued for some time that when ghostly presences are sensed or felt, it's normally when the place has got running water underneath, because running water again generates its own kind of electromagnetic field, which certain sensitive people under certain circumstances can pick up. Now, if this is the case, this explains how we can attune to alternate realities or things that are not part of our normal senses. Now, on top of this, the pineal gland is also light sensitive. So in which case it literally is an eye. You know, it is an eye. And there's something here that is very, very intriguing in this, because one of the things I mention in the book is that at the 45th day of gestation, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, when a baby is developing, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland are effectively one single unit. And it is placed at the back of the throat. And after the 49th day of gestation, the pineal gland and the pituitary gland move up into the center of the brain, and then they become two separate glands. In doing so, there is an argument to say, which has been suggested by various researchers, including an associate of mine, Beach Barrett, who lives in Asheville in North Carolina, who has suggested that this leaves a very, very tiny duct at the back of the throat. And which means that when the pineal gland is stimulated in certain ways, like by the lucid light device, or when you go into deep states of trance or deep states of meditation, it generates something that's known as amrit, or nectar. And what this is a kind of a metallic taste that people get at the back of the throat when they're in these altered states of consciousness.
So the pineal creates that.
The pineal creates it. What happens is the pineal is stimulated to creates endogenously dimethyltryptamine. And some of the dimethyltryptamine, the effect of internal ayahuasca, Now, again, as an aside here, and I'm bouncing all over the place, and my apologies for this, the pineal gland also generates a substance called pinoline. And pinoline is one of the we known excretions. We know it excretes pinoline, and we know it excretes melatonin. But pinoline is an interesting substance because it's an MAO inhibitor. In other words, it's something that stops the actions of monoamine oxidase, which is a substance that actually stops the hallucinatory properties of dimethyltryptamine being effective. And we know that ayahuasca, the drug that is taken, the brew that's taken down in Latin America, which is a concoction of two plants, chacruna and Banisteriopsis caapi. Banisteriopsis caapi actually also contains harmaline, which is also an MAO inhibitor. And what this does is, it means that when you drink ayahuasca, if you, for instance, if you just ate the leaves of chacruna, and just ate them, the DMT containing leaves, and they went into your stomach, nothing would happen. And they wouldn't happen because when they get into the stomach, the MAO inhibitor, the MAO comes out and it stops. This enzyme stops it coming across from the stomach into the bloodstream. The Banisteriopsis caapi contains harmaline, which actually then negates the ability of MAO to stop the DMT crossing into the blood. The pineal gland does exactly the same. It excretes dimethyltryptamine, which is the internal equivalent of the chacruna. It then excretes pinoline, which is the internal equivalent of the Banisteriopsis caapi. And in doing so, we create our own internal ayahuasca. Now, this ayahuasca brew then can drip down the back of the throat and be tasted during certain senses of ecstasy and when you're in altered states of consciousness. Now, this taste in the back of the throat has been known for generations, and I did a little bit of research on this for the book, and I found out that the dripping at the back of the throat, the Sanskrit word for this is something called Shaktipat. And Shaktipat is a mixture of two Sanskrit words. One is Shakti, which means psychic energy, and Pata, which means to fall. So here we have the kind of the linguistic background to exactly what this means. So it's falling psychic energy that falls down the back of the throat. Now, it's also known by the Greeks used to call this concept nectar, the taste of the gods, ambrosia. The word nectar also comes from Indo-European and comes from Sanskrit. And get this, nectar, nek in the word nectar means death, and tar means to overcome. So nectar, the word nectar, means to overcome death. Mm-hmm. You then move back to the word amrit, and amrita, which is also this taste. Amrita in Sanskrit means the elixir of immortality. So suddenly you're getting this huge linguistic link that is explaining exactly what is taking place when we have this taste in the back of the throat. The taste itself there's a technique that people use called Kekara Mudra. And Kekara Mudra is a technique that is taught whereby the adept of this particular technique learns how to roll their tongue back to the back of their throat in order to taste the nectar, the amrit, the ambrosia, the shaktipat that's coming down the back of the throat. Now, Martin, I think you've experienced this, this taste. Are you one of the people I know that's experienced this?
No, but I know someone that has, and it was on ayahuasca actually. This strange dripping at the back of the throat. Yeah.
So you can see here, can't you, the power of the model I'm now developing, and I know it sounds egoistical, and I'm not meaning to sound egoistical, but this is really pulling together something quite profound. Now, one of the major issues that Rick Strassman was the guy in the early 90s that got a grant from the American government whilst at the University of Mexico to do research into dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and how people react to it. And he wrote a book called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. And in this he describes in detail the experiences that the individuals had. Now, one of the major issues Rick had was that Rick argued that the pineal gland was in fact excreting dimethyltryptamine. The problem was that at that time there was no evidence that dimethyltryptamine was excreted anywhere within the brain. It had been found in blood, it's been found in spinal fluid, it's been found in the liver, it's also been found in the dead brains, but it's never been found active in a live brain, which of course is not surprising because the MAO inhibitor stops it quite quickly. So the chances of you ever actually getting a live brain, testing it and finding DMT in it is virtually impossible. However, a few years ago they discovered things called the TARS receptors, TAARS, which are trace amine associated receptors. The trace amine associated receptors are specifically designed to accept dimethyltryptamine. Now, just as an aside, a receptor site in a neuron is rather like a lock to a key. In other words, it's a specific shape, and depending upon the key or the neurotransmitter will depend on whether it will open or react or not. Now, this was the first evidence that it seemed that DMT could be an internal endogenous neurotransmitter. Now, this has been suggested for some time, and people like Arnold Ruho, and there have been other researchers who have presented arguments that something called the sigma-1 receptor in the brain is precisely there to work with dimethyltryptamine. But the issue was there was still no evidence that dimethyltryptamine was in the brain. And if you go on the web now, you'll find that most people will turn around and say, that's where the hypothesis falls dead. Latest news, big news that really isn't as much out there as it should be. A lady called Jimo Borogin at the University of Michigan, around about 2 months ago, announced for the first time that dimethyltryptamine had been found in the live, it's being excreted by a mammal's brain, a rat's brain. They found that dimethyltryptamine was being excreted by the pineal gland. Now, the reason they used rats is the neurological structures within a rat's brain is very, very similar to a human brain. So for the first time, we have absolute concrete evidence that dimethyltryptamine is produced by the pineal gland. We have the implications through the TARS receptors and the sigma-1 receptors that the pineal gland, in fact, that DMT is a neurotransmitter. Now, if that is the case,
so what?
This is the, yeah.
Finish the point.
Yes. Yeah, so this is the final key to say that DMT, as Rick has suggested, is actually the modulator of reality. It's DMT that facilitates our perception of reality externally. It's DMT that facilitates the near-death experience, the out-of-the-body experience, lucid dreaming, the whole thing. They're all DMT related.
How does it facilitate the perception of normal reality? And I was about to ask you about this non-local perception and, connecting with the universal mind. But how does DMT firstly facilitate perception of normal waking reality?
Well, one of the great mysteries of neurology is how the external world is modeled and created by the brain. In other words, I touched upon it earlier with the binding problem and the idea that we have a feeling of simultaneity with everything we perceive, whereas it's being processed by different parts of the brain. Now, the original explanation for this would have been the Cartesian idea, René Descartes' idea, that inside your head is this little man, the homunculus. And the homunculus sits in a little room like the numbskulls in the Old English comic. And they sit in there, and they sit in a little room inside your head, and all the signals come into this one little room. And in this one little room, there's this little version of you that takes it all in. It's where it all comes together in the brain.
Yeah.
The problem with that is it causes an infinite regress. Because if there's a little homunculus in your brain, and it sees and it hears, it must have a little processor inside itself that must be doing the same. So it is self-evident that the Cartesian idea of the homunculus doesn't work. But we still have the problem of how it binds together. Now, the suggestion, as John Joe McFadden has said, is that because the brain works on electromagnetic principles, the brain itself has an ability to draw together information in a way that creates reality and our internal model of reality. However, in the book, what I suggest is that the internal model of reality is as much fabricated by internal things as external. For instance, one of the great mysteries of life is what exactly is out there. In the book, I cite the example of what I call electromagnetic chauvinism. And it's the idea that we believe that what we see through our eyes is everything there is. But of course it isn't. What we see with our eyes is literally the visual part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now remember, we're already saying that the brain works on electromagnetic principles. We know the pineal gland can be stimulated by electromagnetic principles. So here we have some very, very weird ideas about electromagnetism. But effectively, visible light is only a very, very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And I don't think many people realize just how small a part it is. For instance, if you took the electromagnetic spectrum from, I don't know, from radio waves through to gamma rays, which I think are the most energetic, but I'm not sure, people will correct me on this, but they know the principle applies. It would be, and we made it the length of the Mississippi River from northern Minnesota, from the little lake in northern Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico. It's about 6,000 miles. Of course, if you actually if we don't use fractals and things, it's far longer than that, but basically 6,000 miles. The visual spectrum, the world that we think is everything there is, that is fed to us through our eyes, would be 1 inch just south of Hannibal, Missouri. And that's it. 1 inch in 6,000 miles.
Amazing.
Amazing. Yeah, and we think that's everything. It clearly isn't. So whatever the external world is, whatever the stimuli that we receive, it's brought in by electromagnetic radiation, or it's brought in by vibrations which are sound, or it's brought in by the vibrations of you touching something else, and which of course, again, we never touch anything in the external world. You feel you're touching something, you're not. What you're doing is your electromagnetic field, the energy of you is interfacing with the energy of the chair. That's why you don't fall through it, because 99% of it, 99.99% of it is empty space. And it's the energy that gives the feeling of solidity. So here we have again electromagnetic energy, and it's electromagnetic energy which in effect is light. And it means that effectively this is everything. There is no inside or outside. It all just is, and it all just is this form of energy which is somehow processed by the pineal gland, which exists within our brains, which seem to exist within three-dimensional space in some way. And that's where the magic happens.
So the pineal is the pineal is central to all perception.
The pineal seems to be the modulator of perception both internally and externally. In that it seems to be the thing that seems to modulate life. For instance, one of the major mysteries of neurology initially with the pineal gland was the one substance we know that the pineal gland, and has known for many years the pineal gland excretes, is something called melatonin. And melatonin is the chemical that makes us want to go to sleep. Now, the ongoing mystery with that is the pineal gland is situated in the center of the head, the center of the brain. It's in a very, very dark place. There is no natural light in the center of the brain. So in which case, how does the pineal gland know it's going dark? How does the pineal gland know that it needs to excrete melatonin to make you want to go to sleep? The answer is that it sits slightly above something called, I think it's the suprachiasmatic, and I can never remember the second term for the suprachiasmatic. It's something like, it's the suprachiasmatic something, okay. And that sits above the part of the brain which the messages from the eyes, the electrical impulses that the eyes are sending to the back of the head, which processes the information back into a visual image. It sits above that, so there is actual photon leakage coming out into the suprachiasmatic area, and then that then stimulates the pineal gland to realize that the energy or the information that's coming down has dropped off, which leads it to believe that it's gone dark, which leads it to believe it needs to excrete melatonin. So this means that it's the modulator of the sleep and waking cycles. It's also the modulator, strangely enough, of sexuality and growing up. One of the major issues that they found with melatonin, the initial discoveries, was that they came across young children who were becoming into puberty far earlier than normal children. And they found the reason they were doing that, there was a problem with the pineal gland, and the pineal gland was excreting far too much melatonin, which was actually making the gonads develop and everything else. Also, its relationship with the pituitary gland is fascinating as well. They seem to be like the black and the white. They seem to work very closely together. And of course they should do, because they started up as a single thing and they moved up into the major areas of the brain. So it's almost like bootstraps theory here, in the sense, is the pineal gland modulating reality internally and creating the illusion of external reality? In which case it's part of the illusion, isn't it? Because if there is no external space, and if there is no extension in space, and if there's no extension in time outside of the perceiver, how does the pineal gland work? Because it's part of that external reality. And that's the next area I really want to get my teeth into, to understand how a model like this can work. And I have to say we're getting into some very, very deep areas of philosophy, the nature of being, ontology, epistemology. It's really very, very interesting areas here, and this is where I'm planning to go with my next work. But there's a lot in there. There's still a lot to do.
So if we back up to the DMT, there's this receptor that they've discovered in the brain. So what happens when the DMT slots into this receptor in the brain?
Well, that's when it works like any other neurotransmitter, in the sense that it starts to transmit messages along the neurons. And by doing so, either facilitates the electromagnetic field, which it probably does, because what it will do is, what neurotransmitters do, they're the things that transmit information across the brain, across the synaptic gap, because no neurons touch each other. Each neuron in the brain, each 10 billion of your neurons is in contact with round about 10,000 other neurons through these synapses. Now, when the chemical goes across the synapse, a chemical can either be an inhibitor, which actually stops the message going along, or a facilitator, and it facilitates the message going across. In facilitating the message going across, dimethyltryptamine will rapidly move across the brain, because brain signals move at about 800 feet a second, I think. It's somewhere of that region. So they can move across the brain very, very quickly, which can very, very quickly modulate what you're perceiving. So in which case it can stimulate the visual cortex to actually see things that are not in the external world and draw up information from somewhere else. Now this is where the next bit of the hypothesis comes together, because I think what happens is there are photons generated by DNA. DNA generates photons. DNA generates electromagnetic fields. We also know that deep structures in the brain generate electromagnetic fields. We know that electromagnetic fields are also generated by something called the zero-point field, which is everywhere.
So it's a form say that again. Can you say that again about the zero-point field?
The zero-point field itself is a form of energy that is found between subatomic particles. It's a form of energy that hypothetically, they know it's there. They have evidence for it. There's something called the Casimir effect, which actually shows that there is energy coming up from somewhere. For instance, if you freeze something down to just above absolute zero, and you freeze it down to that level, it still has energy coming up from somewhere, from deeper within itself. And it shouldn't, because at absolute zero, there should be no energy by definition, because that's what absolute zero is. The electrons are not moving around anymore, so there's no heat being generated. So there's no energy. But they still find that at that level, there's energy from somewhere. And this energy, according to people like Ervin Laszlo, Bernard Hayes, and various other researchers, is zero-point energy. And zero-point energy is the energy that is everywhere. It's the energy field of the universe. It's the energy field of reality. And everything we perceive is encoded within the 0 point field. And of course the 0 point field, as Irving Laszlo calls it, is the Akashic field. It's like the Akashic record of the Vedas. It's the idea that there is somewhere everything is encoded. Now I believe that under certain circumstances the pineal gland can modulate electromagnetic energy and light that is being drawn up from the 0 point field. In which case it can draw energy from the neurons around it. It can draw, and the neurons themselves probably facilitate this drawing up of energy from somewhere else. This is the light that people talk about when they talk about enlightenment. This is the light people see internally when they work with the lucid light device, the light they see when they have near-death experiences. Now, there is again strong evidence that the human body gives off light. We know that we have this piezoelectric effect, but we also know there are things called biophotons and something called bioluminescence, which is the light that is given off by cells themselves. And in fact, Fritz Albert Popp, who was a researcher and probably still is at Liverpool University, was the guy that first worked on this. Now, on top of that, a guy called István Bokken, who's a Facebook friend of mine, Dr. Bokken is a researcher in Hungary. István has recently discovered that the eyes themselves give off biophotons, which means that the eyes themselves give off light into the external world, which means when people turn around and say somebody has dead eyes or their eyes are alive and there's light, this is actually really happening. We now know that light comes out from living creatures. So this means light is internally generated and externally generated. So we're getting some kind of feedback loop here. So we're getting the feedback loop of the bioenergy. Yes.
So the light is a medium between our minds and this 0 point field, which could be the universal mind.
Correct.
Light is the medium.
And this is where the universal mind comes in. So we've come back full circle now to the reason why things like dimethyltryptamine are called entheogens. The word entheogen means God within, because these facilitate an ability to go inside, deep inside within our own DNA structures, to actually find the God within. And in the book I suggest the God within is DNA. DNA itself is the God. If you read people like Jeremy Narby and The Cosmic Serpent, his book, Jeremy Narby comes very much to a similar conclusion, that he believes that the snake symbolism that people have when they have ayahuasca journeys is the DMT communicating itself. For instance, if you look at the structure of DMT, it's like two snakes whirling round itself. Now again in the book, I refer back to the caduceus. I refer back to the way in which the Ida and Pingala, when people have Kundalini experiences, what are the Ida and Pingala? They're supposed to be two pillars or snakes going up the spine to enlighten this little thing at the top, the pineal gland. For instance, you look at the Staff of Osiris, the design of the Staff of Osiris. What you have is a central pillar, and you have two snakes whirling round it. And at the top there are two wings, and between the two wings there's a single circle. The wings at the top are the hemispheres of the brain, symbolically. The circle at the top is the pineal gland. The structure down the middle is the spine, and the snake symbols are the Ida and Pingala. Now this goes back to Freemasonry. It's found in the Freemasonry symbolism. And very quickly, you then look at the symbolism of Freemasonry. What you get again and again and again is a picture of a pyramid. And the top of the pyramid is rising up, and in between is an eye, the all-seeing eye. I only recently discovered, I should have known this because I do know a little bit of Greek, the word pyramid means pyramidus in Greek, fire in the middle. It's symbolic of sacred geometry saying that the pineal gland is symbolized within this whole structure of the pyramid and the way in which the Masons. And again, if anybody's interested in this, I strongly suggest get hold of a copy of Manly P. Hall's fantastic book, The Secret of the Ages. Manly P. Hall was a historian of Freemasonry and the ancient mystic traditions. He goes on and on and on about the pineal gland. And he goes on about it because this is the secret. The pineal gland is everything. The pineal gland is the most important structure in the brain, and the brain is the most powerful structure we know of in the universe. It's getting very intriguing stuff.
So, the Ida and the Pingala, which comes from the Vedic tradition, I think, which is the idea of these energy channels up the spine.
Correct.
Is that to be taken literally, that there are these energy channels, or is it a symbol of the DNA itself?
I think it's both. I think I have spoken to people who've had Kundalini awakenings, and the thing they say is that they feel this fire going up their spine and an explosion in their head. Now, that form of energy, it's the chi, isn't it? It's chi energy, and whatever the Sanskrit version of it, they're energy channels. And the energy is generated internally. But of course, as well as that, there is, of course, symbolism of what it all means, because of course we then, for instance, one of the things that I found out, and I'm still not sure if this is an apocryphal story, but effectively when Crick and Watson were trying to discover the structure of the molecule of DNA, they really had a problem because they couldn't understand how it was structured. And apparently Francis Crick, was it Francis Crick? Was it Francis Crick? I never know which one was which. But whatever one, I think Crick, the English one, took LSD one evening. And while he was taking LSD, he saw the images of snakes entwined in each other and rolling up and down. And when he saw the structure of the snakes in his LSD dream, and of course LSD can be argued to be an entheogen in exactly the same way, he came to, and then he realized this is how DNA is structured. Now I don't know, that's a story that's told many times, but whether it really happened I'm not sure. But suffice to say that's the story that's put around. So here we have again the idea that DNA itself wants to be discovered. And in fact, if Benny Shannon tells the story, Benny Shannon is an Israeli expert on ayahuasca. And Benny Shannon spent time with the shamans in Latin America. And he tells the story, which might have been told by Alexander Shulgren, I'm not sure, that the shamans were asked how they found, of all the plants in the Amazon, of all 60,000, 50,000 different plants, how they discovered the two plants, the chacruna and the Banisteriopsis caapi, that worked together, that had the MAO inhibitor and the DMT, and how they did that. And the answer was amazing. They said when they were shamanic dreaming, they met the plants, and the plants told them where to look and how to make the substance. And ayahuasca. Now, this again is a suggestion that DNA wishes to be discovered as being what it is. So the two elements, the Crick discovery of the structure of DNA and the way the shamans tell the story of how it was discovered. This is all the secret of the ages. This is all being drawn together.
So there's an idea there that this other mind has agency, that it's reaching into our minds.
I feel, and it's really amazing this because, I'm a lifelong atheist and then agnostic, is that the evidence seems to be that it is now getting to the point where it is trying to communicate with us. Now, Martin, you and I know when we've discussed this very topic of the idea of the universe, in fact, we are all emanations of this consciousness. And what the consciousness is doing is it's living a life vicariously. In other words, if you were God and you were just a single entity, you'd get bored. Of course you would. You've got nothing to do. So what you do is you create a universe, a computer program, a computer three-dimensional game, if you like. And the sprites on the screen, you can then choose to be each and every one of those sprites. And in doing so, you embody yourself in a computer game. And in that computer game, you make sure you forget that you're God. So you don't know that you're God, and you live within the computer game. Now, Philip K. Dick, again, the genius that he was, in the exegesis, his tome that he wrote tons and tons about, he actually writes about this, and he put it in one of his novels. In the novel, The Divine Invasion, there is a character called Manny, who's a little boy. Manny is God, but he's forgotten he's God. and he needs to remember that he's God. And the novel is his gradual discovery of the fact of who exactly he is. Now, Philip K. Dick himself said in his own Theophany, which is again a discovery of God within, he argued that he had suffered anamnesis. And anamnesis is a Socratic term that is the idea that we have forgotten who we are, and only through enlightenment do we discover the fact of who we really are, which is an embodiment of God within this world. Now, if you look to every religious tradition around the world, this is what they are saying. Particularly the esoteric traditions such as Sufism, the Kabbalah, the Gnostic Christians. It's all the idea that we are living in an illusion which we are trapped within. There's a pleroma outside, which is the real reality, which is the single consciousness, but we're trapped within this. And again, comes back to Bill Hicks again, doesn't it? We are all one consciousness. It's explaining itself subjectively. This is a computer program. We are living within a computer program.
So once we know that, where do we go? And where, now that you've written about this, where do you go with your work?
I know this is the thing. This is the thing that blows my mind. That there has to be a reason why this is all being pulled together now. Why is it that well, I mean, this sounds vain, and I don't mean to be vain. I mean, you know me personally, you've met me many times, so you know I'm not like that. But why, if this is the case, how can a sprite, many sprites, because I mean other people are coming up with similar conclusions, but I'd like to believe I'm the only one that's looking at it in a holistic way, doing the neurology and the philosophy and the historical perspectives as well, that if we are now awakening to the fact of our own divinity, how can a sprite living in a computer program become aware of the fact that it's a sprite living in a computer program? Because surely that invalidates the whole computer program. And I sometimes wonder, and this is ridiculous, and I don't do mad theories about, sort of any kind of things like this. But if I was the person that was discovering this, there will be vested interests somewhere that will want to stop me, because if I'm enlightening everybody by writing my books, I'm ruining the whole game. You know, if you're...
Bill Hicks said the same thing. Bill Hicks said the same thing, didn't he? He said, what do we do with the people... He said, exactly, he said, what do we do with the people that tell us this? You know, we shut them up, because these other people have so much invested in this game. So
well, the idea, you know, I know, and this. I know we were joking earlier on about the archons, but I've been reading a lot of work recently by, is it John Lash? I think it's John Lash, and he writes about the archons, and if that is the case, they're not going to like it. Because there's arguments to say there are various levels of entities. Like when people have ayahuasca experiences, they come across other entities. And these entities may have vested interests in keeping us down, trying to stop us crossing the barrier into the reality behind the reality. And is this why, and I go, this is crazy and stupid, but is this why so many things go wrong when I do my interviews and everything else? Now that's paranoia gone crazy. I don't believe that for 1 minute. But if I was given to that worldview, and if suddenly in the next month or two, you know, I fall under a bus or I die for some reason, or I just die under mysterious circumstances, you guys need to carry it on, because that would be evidence of the fact that I had scratched the boil and the pus has come out and I've been drowned in it, you know. I don't believe that will happen, because I don't believe that. But it is interesting to just postulate upon.
It feels more like...
Martin, I just made an joke, I didn't mean it. Scratching the boil. And I then said, this is something we can postulate upon. Or we can postulate upon it. Because of course to postulate is to burst a boil and have pus go all over you. That was my Damon.
Same thing.
My Damon does these jokes all the time. Anyway.
Yeah, I do feel that it's more like the time is right, and that, you know, for this stuff to come out, and you know, it makes me think about a global culture or, a huge culture that accepts these things as reality, that we are all connected, we are all of the one, and now we can live a more peaceful life potentially. But
because if we realize that, we will realize that the pain we give to others, we're giving to ourselves. And there will suddenly be, as Philip K. Dick again was fascinated, the concept of empathy. If we knew what we really were, we'd be empathic. And is this, the whole change that people were ridiculously going on about in 2012? Is this the change that is really happening? It's got nothing to do with a time change. It's got nothing to do with a change from the age of Aquarius or from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius or whatever. It's nothing to do with that. It's to do with inwardly the way we are thinking and seeing the universe and perceiving ourselves. And if that's the case and I'm a facilitator for that, that's really great. But I sometimes wonder, is this why my work is not getting out as much as it should do? And I sometimes wonder, it does seem strange.
I think maybe the way it's going to come is that everybody who wants it has to actually work for it, whether it's experientially or through their own rationality, but you have to do it as an individual. It can't come through the mass media, it can't come through some personality. Each of us has to go and experience it for ourselves, perhaps. So it will be a slow evolution. It will be a slow evolution, but when you actually make that decision for yourself, as I know and when you actually go and look online or whatever, it's amazing how many people have gone before you and are talking about these things, and the information is there. It's so rich. You just have to want it and go and look for it.
Yeah, because one of the things I'd just like to say is to thank my friend Terry Allen for pointing out John Lash to me, and I took the opportunity to listen to some of John's, if it is John Lash, but it's definitely surname Lash, some of his interviews on Red Ice. And it's intriguing. I mean, he really discusses the archons and everything else. I'm aware we're about to run out of time, but I'd just like to touch very quickly and bounce it back to you, because a lot of the things we're talking about here are themes in your own book, Human Plus, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Human Plus is a novel that I wrote to promote non-ordinary states and psychic experiences, based partly on my own minor experiences. But I began that a few years ago, and now at this point, it really feels like the world has changed so much that I didn't need to, in a sense, promote these things because, as we've just said, there's so much evidence out there already. So that was the idea of the book, was to promote these non-ordinary states, which suggest that reality is not what we were led to think it was, which your work is communicating to so many people now.
Well, one of the things I was fortunate and delighted when you gave me an advance copy of Human Plus to read, and I know I had the original version and then the later version, and it genuinely is a fantastic book. I really enjoyed reading it because it works as a mystery story. You identify with the central character and you share his confusions as he encounters mysterious organizations and he becomes part of this mysterious organization. I won't ruin it any more than that. But Martin, could you tell the listeners and the people that will be watching this video as to how they can actually acquire copies of Human Plus?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is martinhiggins.net, where there's some information about it. And then there's links to the Amazon sites where they can pick it up.
Excellent.
So
okay, well, thank you. Wonderful, and I really do strongly advise to check this book out. I mean, it really is, and it looks like I'm just saying that, but I really, really did enjoy it. It was really excellent. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for listening in for the latest edition of Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour. Our next guest will be Manjir Samantha Lawton, Dr. Manjir Samantha Lawton, who is a medical doctor who has really sort of pushed the envelope in terms of the interface between reality and consciousness. And in fact, many of you may have read her amazing book, Punk Science. She also has something called the Black Hole Principle. Manjir and her associates have recently set up and interviewed a group of people, including myself and many other thinkers, in a new movie, which is actually also going to be called Punk Science. So next month I'll be interviewing Manjir about her career, her background, what shapes her tree, why she wrote Punk Science, and exactly what she means by the black hole principle. So please join us again in a month's time and ever onwards then on YouTube with another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Thank you very much.